Today on the Relationship Renovation podcast, we dig into a topic that's sensitive but incredibly important, and that is trauma and its effect on adult relationships.
So we start to protect ourselves from our partner in the same way we unconsciously, unintentionally did as children, and that blocks vulnerability and trust.
67% of children experience some trauma, which means we have a lot of adults in relationship who their relationship is being affected by trauma.
Okay, I could react like this, or what would my adult brain want me to do? Hello, all, and welcome to the Relationship Renovation podcast. I'm Tarah Kerwin.
And my name is EJ Kerwin. And today our subject matter is something that is a little personal to us. But it's also, as clinicians, as therapists, we see it, almost every day. And that's the impact that childhood trauma has on relationships.
Yeah, and healing from childhood trauma in adult relationships, because most of the time in our adult intimate relationships is when a lot of trauma can be triggered. And so we really want to give you an overview of how childhood trauma does impact adult relationships and steps towards healing in the relationship, because I know we wouldn't be sitting here today had we not gone through what we went through and healed through it. And so we are living examples.
Yeah. And
of healing through childhood trauma while in an adult relationship.
Yeah. And I think an important thing whenever I've worked with an individual with trauma is this idea of we don't have to we don't have to measure or compare our trauma. And in fact, there's and I'm not sure, I don't remember who this is. Maybe you'll remember, Tarah, around big T, medium T, little t, that there are big T's, there are assaults. There's abuse, those type of things are sort of the really ground shaking traumas. But trauma can come in a variety of different ways, in neglect and emotional abuse and just witnessing
from
things.
School.
Bullying.
There's so many things. What we do know, this is the latest statistics, is that 67% of children will experience at least one trauma. Yeah. And we also know that children who do experience trauma have more relationship issues in the future. And so
you just do the math on that.
Yeah.
You look at, hey, if 67% of children are going to experience some trauma, then it means that 67% of the adults who are in intimate relationship, have experienced some trauma. And clearly it's going to have an effect on their relationship.
Well, let's want to just get right into it.
Yeah.
How does trauma affect adult relationships? Let me count thy ways.
I think the biggest, and I think I'm maybe moving this to the top, but I think it's incredibly important, is trauma affects our central nervous system, right? It affects how we respond to stressful events. And so the way in which you responded as a child, the way you coped, the way you adapted that got you through that period of your life, oftentimes you take with you into your adult life, and you cope in maybe some of the same ways, which might not be highly adaptive to a healthy relationship.
Well, it's also because it doesn't even have to be a stressful trigger. Sometimes smell can just come out of nowhere, or just a tone of voice. And it's something happens in your body, right? And you always explain that a trigger is something that happens when the response is greater than the stimulus. If the response is greater than the stimulus, you're recognizing that there's something happening in my body that's more than just this, car passing me faster than it should. And that's kind of the start of understanding, what is this feeling? Because the car passing me at a fast pace, it's most people who don't have trauma would probably not even notice it. But somebody who might have trauma, it could mean a lot. How dare them? And that's not fair. And why are they speeding? And just a huge reaction to it.
Yeah, and I think the thing about trauma is there's also a very high likelihood that an individual who suffered some sort of a trauma early on in their life is going to have some sort of either diagnosed or undiagnosed co-occurring disorder. Like anxiety is oftentimes a result of trauma, and why is that? Because when you've experienced something that is unexpected and a very negative experience for you, you're in hyper awareness. You're sort of always ready for something like that to happen again because you want to safeguard yourself. And like one thing, is it okay if I share a little bit of just with Tarah is like she has like a startle response where like if I like walk up behind and just give her a hug or something, she startles, like she jumps. And for a long time, like I really struggled with that because it felt like I personalized it, I made it about me and I didn't understand it,
Yeah. Well, because I can't wait to get into all of that because it's so important how it does play out in intimate relationships. And if you don't have a good understanding or way of communicating about it, of course, you're going to take it personally. Like I'm jumping at like the sight of you. I mean, I didn't even realize what it was, So through our relationship renovation model that we developed, we look at it through an attachment lens, right? And we know attachment plays out significantly in adult relationships. However, we, grow our attachment style through our childhood. And so another way that this shows up is, right, we learn how to regulate our emotions from our environment as children. And let's just say you have this great, calm, safe environment and parents are attuned to you and it's okay to feel all these feelings and they also help you regulate and they give you permission to feel all of the things and like they're there for you. Awesome. Secure attachment. You're probably going to have an awesome, healthy relationship. That's not our job. Our job is to help people understand that, like, for most of us, we didn't have that. We might have had a parent who was an alcoholic, who was very inconsistent in meeting our needs. So what does a child do? They learn to not trust their primary caregiver because it's like, oh, they're sometimes there and they're sometimes not. So I'm just going to learn how to take care of my own needs. They become a little more self-sufficient, a little more independent. Maybe it's a little harder to connect in a vulnerable way in their adult relationships. Maybe there was physical abuse that you're witnessing from the parent. So it's unsafe. So I don't even want to ruffle a feather. I'm just going to make sure I do everything that my parents need me to do. So I don't get in trouble, right? People pleasing, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment. So we recognize, yes, we have a lot of genetic traits inherent to who we are. But when we grow up in an environment where our needs are constantly either being overmet, undermet, or it's unsafe to even express them, we are going to learn how to guard ourselves, compartmentalize, tuck things away because we're children and we do not have a fully developed brain. And that's where you see that central nervous system, it gets very stuck. We'll see couples in our office and they'll start, fighting over whatever. It could be anything. And I can recognize oh, that's a 9-year-old right there. Because it's the central nervous system doesn't get to grow and cultivate all of the emotions and the regulation it can be. So it comes out in these tantrums and how dare you? And we help couples understand their entire attachment past and present, and hopefully going into the future with secure attachment by saying what happened when you were 8? Why do you think this 8-year-old comes out when you guys are fighting? And maybe at 8 is when you went through a significant trauma and you just shut down and nobody helped you. So you had to deal with it on your own. And maybe the way you dealt with it was just reading books and staying isolated. Again, we could spend all day talking about different ways attachment styles, insecure attachment styles show up because of childhood trauma. But the idea is this: when you're not recognizing it and you're in these attachment styles that are insecure, the couple's going to have a really difficult time trying to regulate the system itself.
Well, and I like what you said there in the way you described it, as far as you talked about significant trauma events, but then you also talked about just a sort of, a vibe within a family might have that sort of lower T trauma, but they both have the effect. And it's not like this like old style psychology where we're like, hey, like let's, blame childhood, blame our parents. It's just the fact that like we as human beings adapt to what's going on around us. And so there might be this, there might have been a significant abuse within the childhood, which was sort of this assault to the central nervous system, right? But it also could be like Tarah's talking about, where it was a hostile environment. There was somebody in the household who was angry often. And as a child, you adapt to it. And it's like, okay, there's anger. It can pop up at pretty much any time. So I'm going to get really small and quiet, because if I'm small and quiet, then there's less likelihood that individual is going to get angry at me. The mom, dad's going to get angry at me. And then you get into adult relationship and you become avoidant, right? You become avoidant because you're like, okay, anytime my partner gets mad, I'm just going to get small. Yes. I'm going to get quiet. I'm going to leave. And that it just isn't going to work. It's also not a choice. And that's a big thing in our method, is that we help couples understand the impact of childhood events or childhood vibes that they live through, in order to, instead of like Tarah, we get frustrated because when there was conflict, I really didn't want to engage in it. And that was frustrating to her and she'd get upset with me. But when she realized like, hey, in some ways that's just the way like EJ like learned to live in this life, and it worked for him. He became a person who didn't get into a lot of conflict and it worked. But then in our relationship, it ceased to work. So right. It had a negative effect on our relationship.
So I'm just like conceptualizing all of it because it is a lot. But so when as children, we go into flight, fight, freeze, fawn, whatever we need to do to protect ourselves. It doesn't just go away. It recognizes these triggers like, ooh, big voice. Okay, hide out or run away or whatever it is. And then what happens is we get into these adult intimate relationships and they're so good. They're so fun in the beginning. I was like, there's no trauma triggered whatsoever. And then right, life just happens and like stress happens and transition happens. And what we notice is that guard, that cautionary bubble, the cautiousness starts to build. And so we start to protect ourselves from our partner in the same way we unconsciously, unintentionally did as children. And that blocks vulnerability and trust and really connecting. And those are the couples that usually present in therapy like they are so blocked off from each other because they are now deemed their other person as a threat. And we take them through an entire history of when they were in the womb up until, where they're sitting at in front of us right now. So they can really understand like, it is really not about this other person. Yes, this other person's triggering you. That is inevitable, but there's something else going on here, and let's both understand it. And it's so amazing, EJ, when like we get to do the stories with the couples and you get to see the compassion and the tears fall and like, oh, you also did this when you were 8 and that's what that was, or 10 or 13 or 16. It doesn't matter. Brain doesn't know a trauma timeline. It just knows the experience of something being uncomfortable. And so I'm going to do what I innately did. It's so cool, right? We have these survival skills. Like I, as a child, survived so much. I should not have lived. Like, I really don't think I should have lived, but somehow I did. I like got through it because we're still resilient, but it doesn't work when we're adults, but we don't even know. Like I would not have known all of the trauma was being triggered because I had set my life up perfectly, right? I had had my own little condo. I could keep everything clean, didn't have a lot of overstimulation. Little did I know, 4 kids later and 4 pets and all the stimulation and colic would actually trigger this central nervous system that felt overwhelmed. So sometimes we don't even know what's there until it's presented with itself. And then the kind of the negative thing that happens is like, oh, I shouldn't be in this. This is bad. I had no idea how bad this would be. Or, oh my gosh, there's something inside of me that's never been triggered before that feels so overwhelming. Let's look at this together. most people don't want to look at it. It's terrifying. Like, why did you just trigger me like that? I shouldn't be feeling like this. And so we slow down the process and we give so many tools that we'll get into towards healing in the relationship. But we really wanted to, talk about how it affects adult intimate relationships in so many ways. And if we could help one couple like we helped ourselves, like I'm good, I'm happy.
So if we kind of circle back a little bit, we're presenting this idea that 67% of children have some sort of traumatic event, which is incredibly high, right? Which means we have over 50% of individuals within a relationship have some adaptation from a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events in their life. It's affecting their relationship. It shows up in attachment style. It shows up in anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, in extreme cases in disorganized attachment, right? And what happens is you become triggered eventually by your partner, that there are or just the circumstances of being in a more complicated adult life, having children, having the stresses of a job, having an intense boss, or just like something happens, a sight, a smell, a sound that triggers it and it goes off. And it begins to then create a chasm in your relationship because your partner most of the time doesn't understand what's going on. Like they just notice that there's a change or as you guys get deeper into your relationship, there's this aspect of you that they didn't know was there. And so it depletes trust. It depletes the ability to be vulnerable and open it and eventually intimate. And then the next thing that comes into it is that oftentimes we find really unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with the way it's showing up in our adult life.
It's not like couples have that one triggering moment and they're like, oh, okay. Like they allow themselves to have it over and over and experience it over and over again. It becomes intolerable. And so all of the unhealthy coping mechanisms that we see, infidelity, substance abuse, maybe more looking at porn or porn addiction, shutting down, people pleasing, you name it. There's so many different ways we, even just scrolling through the phone, right?
Yeah, just not being present, for your partner.
We learn how to disconnect because connection is too painful.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is oftentimes, I see this almost like uniformly with couples, is that you blame either the relationship itself or you blame your partner. I think I think both of us have struggled with that over the years of like, when I'm in that uncomfortable place, it's just like, Tarah, just stop doing this thing. And EJ, if I don't feel safe, you aren't safe. This isn't where I'm supposed to be.
I'm going to share, I promise I'll keep this short, EJ, so don't look at me like I'm talking too much. But I'm going to share how, for me, my trauma showed up in many ways, but I would say the majority of it was when I met EJ, he just met all my needs and he was super into me and intuitive. And I loved that. And then, if you have been listening to our podcast, we got pregnant with twins on our honeymoon and EJ had already had 2 kids. So I went from 0 to 4 kids in a year and a half. And I was like, cool, this is going to be awesome. And then what happened, and he's already had 2 kids. So he knows all of this. And what happened was, when our life got very stressful and twins had colic and nursing and you name it, I was like, EJ was not meeting my needs. First of all, I didn't know how to say my needs, right? I couldn't have a voice. If I had a voice when I was little, I would have got the shit smacked out of me. There's no voice. I can't say, hey, I'm really needing this. No, never happened. Never, right? I started working at 8 to buy my twin and I food. I've always taken care of myself. So then these things started happening, these unmet needs that I thought EJ should just know. Doesn't he know I'm exhausted? Doesn't he know he should just take the kids and hire me a masseuse to come into the house? It was just so crazy. And I started to get so angry, how dare you not know what I need? And I remember it was gosh, after a year that the twins were born, we were having a family picnic and a family, barbecue at our house. And my sister was visiting and her mom, her mother-in-law and your mom was there. And like everyone was just talking amongst themselves, having drinks. And I am like with the twins and giving them baths and nursing and feeding. And no one's looking at me. No one's being like, God, should I help Tarah? What's going on? Because I felt like I'm a Wonder Woman. I can do this, right? And I literally just screamed at that barbecue, can someone please effing help me? And that's when I was like, oh God, that came out bad. And I just scared the crap out of everybody. And I recognized then like unmet needs from my childhood were very profound. I get into this intimate relationship with EJ. I expect that he's the one person that's going to know my needs and meet them. I never knew how to have a voice, so I didn't know how to state those needs until it became so big that it blew up like a volcano. And that was the start of like something really big is happening here, more than I know. And I can't expect EJ to know what I need unless and everyone looked at me, they're like, well, we didn't know you were even like needing help. You're like such a freaking rock star. And that's when I realized, God, I've put on this front my whole life to just get through and get it all done and make sure everybody's safe. And I don't care about me, but I really do, but I don't know how to care about me. And so that was like how trauma showed up for us. And had we not got to that point or whatever, like I just kept blaming you and like getting mad at you. And like, I didn't know how to put it into words. And now I can easily put it into words. I can ask for what I want every hour of the day if I need to. And I got really good at it, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that with us, it was also like this like slow, but also at times rapid unfolding. Because you were always very upfront about your childhood and what you'd gotten through. But it you had been able, like you said, you'd been able to cope with it as a single person and not have it sort of spill out. Or at least maybe not consistently, because you would be with somebody for a couple of years or whatever, date somebody. But us in long-term relationship, it took us a while to totally like understand it, right?
Yeah, I normally left relationships when it got triggering. I'm like, oh, they're not for me. The grass is greener. See you later.
Yeah.
And somehow with you, man, I just knew that I didn't want to leave you.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you were telling that story too, I was just thinking like, because I became triggered by the anger and resentment, right? Because that hits stuff from my childhood, but I didn't see that part of you until I think I saw it once, like early on in our relationship. But it was like brief. It was when you broke up with me and kicked me out of your house. But it felt like kind of like a normal, like, I don't know what happened, but all right. And then we made up really quickly. But I never saw it consistently until we entered into the stress of the family, 4 kids, money.
It lies dormant. It was lying dormant. It was still there always. I just didn't
understand it, but I didn't understand
it.
And I didn't
either.
And then I got triggered. Yeah. And then I was just like, what's your problem? Just like you were saying, what's your problem? I was saying, what's your problem? And I think this, circling back to everybody out there listening, this is what you kind of want to, like you want to begin to take this on and begin to take some steps towards healing. That starts with just understanding.
Yeah. I mean, this is why we're doing this podcast, because if you take a U-turn, instead of just saying, God, this relationship feels so bad, I don't want to do this anymore, but I feel stuck because we have kids. And if there is a history of childhood trauma for either one of you, look at it in a different way. And the first step is to just have that awareness, right? Are there any patterns that I'm recognizing, triggers from childhood that are showing up? I mean, we have this amazing exercise that we take all of our couples through, and I do it all the time. I don't have to do it anymore because I feel like it's crazy, right? I don't have to do our cognitive relational restructuring hardly at all anymore, but I used to do it all the time because it basically, right, a trigger happens and you're like, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm thinking, here are the behaviors, and then you're like, what does it remind me of? And you try to go back and be like, God, when else did I feel this like terrified and scared or shaky? And you can go back and start to recognize like, wow, I started to develop this belief about myself that I'm not safe when I was like 6 years old. I mean, you can take this technique and find out so much about yourself because our body holds on to all of it. And if we start to really recognize and trace back, when did this start? How did this start? What does it feel like? We really start to mature our nervous system, which that's the freedom part, right? Think of it stuck. It got like developmentally delayed because there was bad, mistrusting things happening in our environment. And now we're adults. And guess what? The brain's this amazing, beautiful thing. And it's so resilient and it's got that plasticity. We can change it. So we're like maturing our nervous system.
Well, and even though it took us a while, to get to sort of the more secure place that I feel like we're currently at in our relationship. When we would use tools like this, it didn't like completely change the game, but it provided moments of relief because when Tarah would take some trigger, like there was this moment where I wanted to put the dogs in her car. We've talked about that before, and it ended up in this big argument. And then when she was able to walk it through this relational cognitive restructuring and then share that it was about not being heard and being unimportant and how she's always felt that way. Like I was then able to put my stuff aside and I was able to at least briefly be empathetic and listen to her, right? And that's what you need to break out of is just your instinctive responses that one person gets triggered, the other person gets upset by the way that person responds to their triggered, so they're triggered, and then it's just off to the races. That having a technique, we've talked about RAIN, we've talked about the cognitive restructuring, just having a way where you can go deeper, journaling about it, and then coming back to your partner, sharing like, this was what was going on for me. It opens up the gateway for empathetic, vulnerable, like we talked about. Trauma can keep you away from vulnerability. This brings you back to vulnerability, which then connects you.
So first step, right? Awareness. Are there patterns? Are there things that happen in childhood? 2, trying to communicate with your partner, how to share past experiences in a way that fosters understanding, right? So then that leads to, right, the next step, which is building that emotional safety. The more you can talk about this and it's receptive and it's heard and it fosters, right, shared commitment, shared connection. I mean, that's where the growth is right there. That's like where the magic happens. You get to build this emotional safety, and then you get to be who you need to be without conditions in this environment. That's where you get to start healing from it, right? How do you heal in this adult relationship if you don't have that emotional safety?
Yeah.
I mean, I was able to get through not all my stuff. I still get through all my stuff, but like, because you were able to take a step back, understand, have compassion, and then we heal together through it. That's the beautiful part. But you've got to take those steps in order to get to that place. And even if it's, right, seeking support, because we are big believers in therapy, right? And then maybe you don't even know how to share this with your partner because your relationship is so toxic. Maybe you go to a few sessions for individual and say, here's what's happening for me, or go to that couples therapy. Like seeking support is beautiful. And when I started having all of my trauma triggers after the twins were born, I just ordered a lot of books. I remember it made me feel like I'm not alone. This is happening to other people because this book is a bestseller. So that must mean like thousands of people are buying it. I mean, just starting the steps made me feel really good.
Yeah, and it's empowering within your relationship because you begin to do things differently. And maybe at first it's just episodic, like we just deal with this one conflict like slightly better. But what we find is, our measurement tool, the intensity, the frequency, the duration begins to go down because now we still get triggered. Like I can see the look in Tarah's eye when there's some stimulus, there's something that I've done, something she's witnessed. I can see that look in her eye, but the intensity is less. my response to it also is much more mindful and thoughtful, which means that oftentimes the duration shortens because if I go into my autonomic responses and I start avoiding her and I just like go out and, do some project outside to just get away from her, and then she feels even worse and more abandoned. If I know now I got to stick with her, I need to move towards her. I need to be caring and loving. I need to maintain eye contact. When I do those things, then I don't exasperate it. I don't make it as bad. And then vice versa. Like Tarah can tell when I'm
I was going to be like, hey, I want some
yeah, well, I mean, I think that
kudos for supporting you and maturing your nervous system too. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, I think that I'm trying to think. Like, I think that you recognize now that that anger is something that's tough for me.
Yeah,
and you adapt to it. You're gonna get angry with me. That's gonna happen. Yeah. But I think you have a higher level of awareness now. Just like I do around certain things that like, hey, okay. But then also like, cause ultimately it's my job to deal with the trigger better. I'm also more now able to tell you, hey, I feel like you're yelling and you can, maybe you don't think you're yelling or maybe you're not yelling, but I'm just feeling it. But you can also like respond to it and be like, okay, he's probably triggered. So any raise of my volume is going to feel like I'm yelling at him. So we understand each other better.
I mean, just think of it like this, listeners. How cool would it be if we got to help each other mature our nervous system to be adults? It's like so cool. Yeah. It's like, I don't have to react that way anymore. That's the intensity, frequency, duration. You see it going down, meaning you are regulating so much better. And it's in that moment that you're just like, okay, I could react like this. Or what would my adult brain want me to do? Like that's when you're starting to really process through and heal, you'll be able to pause and be like, what does my actual adult self want? Not my kid self. My kid self wants to be, please right now, instant gratification. Ow. And you're just like, well, no, it's okay. Like that's not going to happen. And here's how to do it. And so, I'm inviting you on reflecting, how does your past impact your present? How might it be showing up in your relationship?
So we've identified the fact that that our past, and some have big T's, some medium T's, that trauma has an effect on how we act within our relationship that oftentimes doesn't appear until we're deep into the relationship. We are believers and are also students of engaging in a process that's going to help you understand more about yourself and more about your partner so that you can be vulnerable, you can be open, and you guys can adapt in thoughtful, intentional ways to one another. And so what does that look like? Tarah's mentioned it a little before. It might mean starting off with just some individual therapy or individual coaching, or reading books about trauma or about attachment history. It could be something like, like our Relationship Renovation at Home program, where it's a structured way that you set goals as a couple, you explore your past together, chunks. You move towards that relational cognitive restructuring exercise where you actually have a rubric to go through a triggering moment and get to what the negative core belief is and where it came from. But you stick with a process, because these aren't quick U-turns. These aren't just like, oh, I went the wrong direction, I got to flip around. Yeah. These are corrections that over time become sustainable. And so our advice is definitely get into some approach, some method of understanding yourself, understanding your partner, and preferably together. Like, I think that's the power of relationship.
It's so worth it. It is. It can feel very uncomfortable in the beginning, but it's an emotional risk. And if we don't take an emotional risk, what does that mean, right? We're staying stuck. And we don't want to stay stuck. We want something bigger than that. There's also a great book, a few books. We'll make sure to reference them, but one of the ones I read was called Getting Past Your Past, Francine Shapiro. Like, I love that book. She was a developer of EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing for trauma. But I loved it. It was a great self-read. It had little exercises at the end of every chapter. So we'll plug that into our notes.
Yeah. So, we'd love to have you get involved in the discussion with us. Please check out our social media on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, wherever you are, Relationship Renovation.
YouTube.
Yeah, and if you're not watching our show, go and check us out on YouTube. We have a channel there. We have many episodes. We have shorts. We have mid-length clips. If you want to reach out to us directly regarding what we're doing and ways we might be able to support you, whether it be through our online program, if you're local, coming into our office, or coming up some coaching as well, please reach out to us, info@relationshiprenovation.com.
And if you have gone through our R&R at home model and you want to be guests on our podcast, reach out. We are going to have more couples on sharing their stories of success to just build that positivity and hope that things can be different. And here are all these living examples. So we're super excited.
Absolutely.
So thank you for listening. As always, take care of yourself and each other. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.